Right, thank you very much, Desiree. I've got Matthew Parks with me. He's based here in Parliament from COSATU. Thank you so much for joining us, Matthew. Of course, there's a massive wrangle going on between Labour and the government around the public sector wage bill. The government did renege on paying public sector workers what they were due in the 2020 financial year, and you guys are contesting it all the way to the Apex Court, and that is potentially going to frustrate government's plans to try and fiscally consolidate.
Sure. Look, we appreciate government's fiscal pressures. As Labour, we want government to survive. If government collapses, workers suffer.
Yeah.
But government has to respect workers' constitutional right to collective bargaining. They need to go and engage with workers at the Public Service Bargaining Council, and that's how you resolve issues. If you don't do that, if you undermine collective bargaining, you actually incite labour market instability. It's going to be very difficult to get public servants to be motivated to implement the economic recovery plan, the State of the Nation address commitments, if they feel that government is throwing them under a bus. And a 4-year wage freeze is in effect a 15% salary cut. The real cause of the fiscal crisis is not the wage bill, which has been stable at 35% of the budget for more than a decade. It's the fact that we lose 10% of the budget to corruption and wasteful expenditure. That's 150 billion rand every year. We have to bail out state-owned enterprises at a cost of billions of rands every year because of mismanagement. That we have billions lost to tax and customs evasions because of the decapacitation of SARS during the state capture era. But also you have a stagnant economy where workers are being retrenched and hence declining tax revenues. So government is looking for a lazy, low-hanging fruit as opposed to dealing with the heart of the fiscal crisis.
But we can't run away from the fact that when we compare ourselves to other emerging markets, our public sector wage bill stands at about 14-15% of GDP, whereas other countries that percentage or proportion is far much lower, and therefore ends up crowding out spending on other priorities.
Look, we have to compare South Africa to South Africa's situation. Government actually increased the amount of public servants in 2008 because there was a lack of skilled workers like doctors and teachers, police officers, nurses. If you impose a wage freeze, what you're going to see then is that a flight of skilled labour from the public service. You're going to see teachers moving to the private schools. You're going to see doctors and nurses being poached by countries in the Middle East, by New Zealand, Australia, where they get paid better salaries. So you have to look at what are the needs of South Africa. We've seen during COVID-19 the need for a well-functioning, capacitated state. But again, you can pay workers a pittance. Apartheid era paid people a pittance. They didn't achieve anything, but you have to deal with the fundamental crisis, which is corruption, wasteful expenditure, a stagnant economy, and so forth. And if government was serious about saving costs, they should engage with us. We would be happy to, for example, to say, can the ministers be cut by a third? Can we scrap deputy ministers? Can we reduce the exorbitant salaries we pay management in the state and politicians? Let government lead from the front. Instead, what they're doing is throwing workers under the bus.
Now, in terms of, you talked about being willing to go back to the table, which is obviously your right as well. But how do you think government and Labour could meet halfway? Given, it's one thing to have the principle of, collective bargaining and all of that and to meet halfway. But the reality is that we are where we are in terms of our fiscal crisis, our high levels of debt. So when we're in this situation, what do you do to try and meet halfway so that it's a win-win on both sides and government can get towards a situation where it's able to begin to stabilize the fiscal situation?
Sure. Look, the first thing is they have to come into the Public Service Bargaining Council and engage workers. By simply declaring a fait accompli at Parliament, imposing a 4-year wage freeze, it actually collapses the space to engage. We've made actually many contributions to say how can we help address the state crisis, for example, our Eskom Social Compact, in assisting to rebuild Eskom. The only source of relief last year into the economy and currently is from the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which is workers' monies. So we want government to engage with us in good faith. We can find each other. I think number one, which really helps around the wage bill, is that inflation has actually plummeted by 50%. It was budgeted at 5.5%, is now sitting at 3% and likely to decline further. But also we think you have to protect the lower and middle income earners in the state. That's the nurses and teachers, the police officers, the prison wardens, who often earn a very small salary, protect them from inflation, and then impose a wage freeze and cut on what management earns, what politicians earn. Have a single wage agreement for the entire state, not just the public service, which is 2/3 of the state, but also include the entities, the SOEs, etc. But you have to Also, you can't run away from it. You have to deal with corruption and wasteful expenditure. That is the heart of the crisis, and how to stimulate the economy so you can grow it, so people can pay their taxes and so forth.
Yeah, I suppose the SOEs are a big part of the problem, isn't it? Because you've got middle managers and upwards who do get quite stonking salaries.
At Eskom alone, you have 800 managers earning more than 2 million rand a year.
Sure.
And that ballooned by tenfold. It used to be 80 until about a decade ago. You see a ballooning of management posts across the state. You have ministers who actually now no longer can appoint 11 staff, but can appoint 18 staff, often unqualified. So really government has to take its own medicine if it wants workers to make a compromise. Workers are keen to save the state. We don't want to go the IMF route because workers would suffer, but government has to engage with us, and there are solutions we have tabled which can help address the issue.
Yeah. Do you think it would add insult to injury if indeed the finance minister were to raise taxes this time around?
Look, it's very difficult now in this kind of economic crisis, but we think the past few years have seen us shifting the tax burden to working middle class families with the VAT increase, the municipal electricity increases and so forth. We wouldn't want to see any more increases for the working middle class families, but we think there is a bit of space upon the wealthy in terms of income tax for those who earn above R1 million, in terms of inheritance and estate duties, but also in terms of import duties for luxury goods. There is some space, but again, we'd rather see an investment in SARS's capacity by giving them more staff and more resources, updating the systems, because that will assist them to crack down on the billions of rands lost to tax evasion, customs fraud, and the illicit outflow. And there you're talking about hundreds of billions. So really, if you can invest in SARS, you can really actually save huge amounts, and that will also protect local manufacturing jobs from cheap imports from overseas.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Matthew, for that. Matthew Parks of COSATU giving us his views on how he thinks Tito Mboweni should be proceeding with the budget, talking about how it's absolutely a non-starter to tax working and middle-class families. Of course, we are going to be here at 2 o'clock in the parliamentary precinct when Tito Mboweni, the finance minister, delivers his budget speech, which we're all eagerly anticipating and speculating about. Do make sure that you stay tuned for that. We're going to hand over back to studio. Desiree?